So I grew up here in Binghamton. I went to the Roberson Museum as a kid. So I went to college for I was a history and film major in college, and then I kind of always knew I wanted to do documentaries. And so I started working at WSKG. When I first got out of college, I worked some film studios, and I worked at commercial TV. I worked at BNG for a couple years, but then I got the job over at SKG. And when I first was working there, I worked we were doing a lot of auctions and membership drives and things like that. And then I kind of just went to him one day and said, hey, I had an idea for a local documentary. It was actually about World War II veterans. At this time, this was in the late 90s. I I had talked to a couple gentlemen who were at Pearl Harbor the day it was bombed. And yeah, who were from Binghamton. There was actually probably 6 or 7 at the time in the late 90s who were still alive, were in Pearl Harbor. One of them was named John Kuzma, and he was a fireman on the Binghamton Fire Department for years. And so I interviewed him, and I found some other folks, and I did a film called From the Valley to Victory. That was my first film that was all about the Southern Tier and World War II. My kids when I started having children, they went to camps there, and I've always been fascinated by the Roberson Mansion. And I've known Michael for years. We used to work together. And years ago, I went on one of the ghost tours, and it was packed. There was a ton of people. And I remember thinking, oh, this is a really interesting way to get people into the mansion. But I, haven't been on the Historical Society board and studied history in the area, knew that the mansion had a really rich and interesting history. Not that I had ever really researched it as much as I did for this film. But I thought it would be interesting to tell the story about the Roberson Mansion and use the ghosts as an entrance into how did this mansion come to be? How did it become a museum? Who were the people behind it? And so I just thought it was fascinating that people knew a lot about the ghost stories, but they didn't know a lot about the story behind the mansions. And that's how I kind of started researching and wanted to do the film. People like to know the background of why things are the way they are. I did a film several years ago about the first hockey team that played here, the first professional hockey team, the Dusters. And that came about because I was at a hockey game one time, and I remember listening to folks behind me talking about how did hockey ever come here. And so I thought, oh, that's an interesting story. And I grew up going to the Dusters, and so I like telling stories about why things are where they are or how they are. And so with Alonzo's ghost, I know that a lot of people know the museum, but they didn't know the history behind it. And it's an interesting history, how Alonzo Roberson and his wife, even before they started building this mansion, knew that someday they wanted it to be a place for education. They knew that they wanted it to be a place where people could come. And so that went into the whole way it was designed. And it went in, and if you read, and I have a big part of this in the film, if you read what Alonzo said he wanted in his will the mansion to become, it's what it's become. And that's a credit to the hundreds of people who've served on the board at Roberson, and it's the credit to the people who have served as executive directors there, including Michael Grasso currently. I mean, that mission statement, basically, that Alonzo Roberson wrote almost 100 years ago, really is used still today. It's one of the reasons that I wanted to do the film, was because I wanted to tell the background story of Alonzo Roberson. And what's interesting is, at the same time that he was kind of gathering this idea, we have to remember in this community there were other people like George F. Johnson, and there was Thomas Watson at IBM. There was going to very soon afterwards, there was going to be Edwin Link. All of these local grown philanthropists who are also industrialists adopted this mindset that it was important to give back to the community. And now in this community, George F. Johnson is kind of the standard bearer for that. The carousels, the parks. At the time when Endicott Johnson and the shoe industry was thriving, there were very few other industrialists who provided for their employees like George F. Johnson. And that is kind of the culture that Alonzo Roberson was working in at that time. And I talk about this in the film, his lumber business was one of the most successful lumber businesses in America at the time. Perhaps one of the largest this east of the Mississippi. And I think that there's a quote in the film where almost 90% of the homes that were built in Broome County at the time had lumber that came from Roberson lumber. And so this whole culture that he was operating in was something that he actually, I believed, wanted to build on. And he wanted to maybe not give a park or a carousel, but he wanted to give a lasting monument to the community, being this museum. I find it comforting for myself and to think that still in this community we have people who are working to make sure that that spirit of what Alonzo wanted this museum to be continues to thrive, and that we should all be proud of as a community, of what this museum has given to generations of families over the years and will continue to give for many years to come. And that's really what I wanted that film to be about, was it's a place of pride for all of us, because it has become such a center of affection in many ways for many families over the years, a place that they continue to want to go for lots of different reasons, whether it's the holiday forests, or if it's the many different camps, or if it's the galleries or things like that. We should all be proud of this wonderful museum that so many people have had a hand in making and helping succeed.